The great hall of the Galactic Council was huge and cold, with walls that reached so high they seemed to touch the stars themselves, and Captain Dae-ho Kim stood at the center of it all, wearing his best uniform and feeling very small in the massive space around him, while 47 different alien species sat in their floating seats and looked down at him with eyes that showed no kindness or understanding. Just fear and anger and something that might have been hate, though he tried not to think about that too much because it made his chest feel tight and his hands want to shake, but he kept them steady at his sides because he was representing all of humanity today, and that was not something he could mess up, not when so much was riding on what happened in the next few hours. And beside him, Ambassador Hyojin Park stood just as straight and just as calm, though he could see the tiny muscle jumping in her jaw that told him she was just as angry as he was about being here like this. Like criminals being judged by people who had never fought a real war or built something with their own hands or faced down the kind of dangers that humans faced every single day without even thinking about it. And the whole thing felt wrong and unfair and like a bad dream that he wanted to wake up from, but could not, because this was real, and this was happening, and the future of his entire species was sitting in this room waiting for someone to decide. It for them, Supreme Chancellor Velthara, was a tall, thin creature with too many arms and skin that looked like it had never seen sunlight. And when she spoke, her voice echoed through the chamber like the sound of metal scraping against stone, cold and harsh and completely without any warmth or feeling. And she was telling them all the reasons why humanity was dangerous, and why they needed to be controlled and managed like some kind of wild animal that might bite if left alone. And Dae-ho listened to every word and felt his anger growing hotter and brighter with each passing moment, because these aliens were talking about his people like they were monsters or children or something less than what they really were, which was the smartest and strongest and most determined species in the galaxy, even if they were also the youngest and newest to space travel. And that seemed to be the problem right there, that humans had done in 200 years what most species took thousands of years to do, and that scared the Council more than they wanted to admit. So instead of celebrating human achievement, they wanted to crush it and make it small and manageable and safe for everyone else. The ultimatum came in 3 parts, and each one was worse than the last, starting with the demand that humanity surrender all their military ships and weapons to Council control, which was like asking them to cut off their own arms and legs and then smile about it. Because human ships were not just transportation or tools of war, but symbols of freedom and independence and the right to go wherever they wanted in the universe without asking permission from anyone. And the second demand was even worse, that all human colonies would be placed under Council oversight with alien administrators making decisions about how humans should live and work and raise their children, as if humans were too stupid or too dangerous to govern themselves, which was ridiculous because human colonies were thriving and peaceful and more successful than most alien worlds. But success seemed to be another thing that made the Council nervous. And the third demand was the worst of all, that humans would have to submit to something called cultural adjustment programs, which sounded innocent enough until you realized it meant aliens would decide what human children could learn and what human adults could think and what human art and music and stories were acceptable. And that was the moment when Dae-ho knew there would be no compromise and no negotiation, because you could ask humans to give up a lot of things, but you could never ask them to give up the right to be human. Back on Earth in his office in Seoul, Prime Minister Tae-woo Lee watched the whole thing on his communications screen, and his face showed nothing at all. Not anger or fear or surprise, just the calm, steady look of a man who had expected this day to come for a long time and had been preparing for it in ways that the Council could not imagine, because while they had been making speeches about peace and cooperation, humans had been building and planning and getting ready for the moment when the galaxy would try to put them in chains, and that moment was now, and he was ready for it. Even though it hurt his heart to know that the dream of peaceful cooperation between species was ending before it had really begun. But sometimes, dreams had to die so that better things could be born, and he believed with all his soul that whatever came next would be better than bowing down to aliens who saw humans as problems to be solved instead of friends to be valued. The chamber fell completely silent when Dae-ho finally spoke, and his voice was calm and clear and carried easily to every corner of the huge room, and he said just 2 words that would change everything forever, which were, "We refuse." and the sound of those words seemed to hang in the air like thunder before a storm. And then the aliens started talking all at once, their voices rising higher and higher as they tried to understand how any species could simply say no to the Galactic Council, because in their experience every species eventually bent the knee and accepted whatever terms they were given. But humans were different, and they were about to learn exactly how different in ways that would shake the foundation of everything. They thought they knew about power and control and what happened when you push the wrong species too far. Ambassador Hyojin stepped forward then, and her voice was just as calm as Daeho's had been. But underneath the calm, there was something else. Something that made even the bravest aliens shift uncomfortably in their seats. And she told them that humanity was withdrawing from the council effective immediately, and that they wished everyone, well, which sounded polite and diplomatic, but was actually the most devastating thing anyone had ever said in that chamber. Because it meant humans were walking away from everything they had built together over 2 centuries. All the treaties and trade agreements and scientific cooperation and shared knowledge, all of it gone in an instant because the council had decided that fear was more important than friendship, and now they were going to learn what the galaxy looked like without humans in it, and Daeho suspected they were not going to like what they found. News of humanity's withdrawal spread across the galaxy faster than light itself, carried by quantum communication networks that humans had helped build and maintain for over a century, and on every world where humans lived or worked or had ever set foot. The same incredible thing started happening at exactly the same time, which was that every human ship began powering up their engines, and every human station started broadcasting the same message over and over again, which was that they were going home and taking everything with them. And the aliens who heard this message did not understand what it meant at first, because humans had been scattered across thousands of worlds for generations, and many of them had never even seen Earth. So how could they all be going to the same home? But they would learn soon enough that humans had been planning for this day longer than anyone realized, and that their idea of home was bigger and stranger than anything the galaxy had ever seen before. Admiral Sujin Choi stood on the bridge of the massive battleship Taeguki and watched as her screens filled with the signatures of human vessels from every corner of known space, from tiny personal shuttles that could barely hold 2 people to enormous colony ships that housed millions. And they were all moving in the same direction, following flight paths that had been calculated years ago and stored in secret databases that only humans knew about. And the sight of it filled her with pride and sadness at the same time. Pride because her people were capable of something this massive and coordinated and beautiful, but sadness because it meant leaving behind everything they had built and all. The friends they had made among the alien species who were not part of the Council's decision to treat humanity like a threat instead of an ally, and those friendships had been real and valuable, and it hurt to know they were ending, not because of anything humans had done wrong, but because other species were too afraid to stand up for what was right. The Council moved quickly to implement their sanctions and punishments, freezing human bank accounts and closing borders and declaring human ships unwelcome in Council space. But they discovered something that shocked them to their core, which was that humans did not need any of those things as much as the Council needed humans, because every human colony was completely self-sufficient with its own farms and factories and power sources. And human technology was so advanced and so well designed that it could not be shut down or controlled by alien systems, which was something humans had insisted on from the very beginning when they first joined galactic civilization. Though at the time everyone thought it was just human paranoia and stubbornness, not realizing it was actually human wisdom and preparation. For exactly this kind of situation, Dr. Bo Ram Shin worked through the night in her laboratory on Mars, uploading terabytes of scientific data to the Galactic Information Network. Everything humans had learned about medicine and engineering and physics and biology during their time in space, and she did it with tears streaming down her face because this knowledge represented the work of millions of human scientists over 2 centuries, discoveries that could save lives and solve problems and make the universe a better place for everyone. But humans were giving it all away for free as a parting gift, because that was the kind of species they were. Generous and hopeful, even when they were being treated badly, and she hoped that someday the aliens would understand what they were, losing when they chose fear over friendship, though she suspected it would take a long time for that understanding to come, Probably too long to matter for the current generation of leaders who had made this terrible choice on Proxima Station. The largest trading hub in the Outer Rim, engineer Minho Jiang supervised the most difficult job of his life, which was systematically dismantling everything humans had built or improved or maintained over the past 50 years. And that turned out to be almost everything important on the station, from the fusion reactors that provided power to the computer, systems that managed air and water and artificial gravity, and he did it carefully and thoroughly because humans took pride in their work even when that work was destruction, and he made sure that every piece of human technology was either removed completely or rendered completely useless. Because if the Council wanted independence from humanity, then they would get complete independence, with all the challenges and problems that came with it, and he tried not to think about the millions of aliens who would suffer when the station's systems started failing because that was not his choice or his fault. It was the choice of leaders who had decided that human help was more dangerous than human absence. The scale of human integration into galactic civilization only became clear as the evacuation continued, and the Council representatives who had been so confident about forcing human compliance began to understand that humans were not just another member species, but the foundation that held everything else together. Because human engineers had designed the hyperlane navigation systems that made faster-than-light travel safe and reliable, and human doctors had developed the medical protocols that kept dozens of alien species healthy in mixed environments. And human farmers had created the agricultural techniques that fed half the galaxy's colonies, and human teachers had written the educational programs that helped alien children learn about the universe. And human artists had created the entertainment that brought joy and wonder to billions of beings across thousands of worlds. And now all of that was being carefully and methodically removed, not destroyed out of spite or anger, but simply taken away because it belonged to humans, and humans were leaving Captain Yuri. O commanded one of the deep space exploration fleets that had been mapping the void between galaxies for the past decade, and her ships were equipped with technology so advanced that most aliens did not even know it existed. Devices that could manipulate space and time in ways that seemed like magic, but were actually just human engineering pushed to its absolute limits. And she had been waiting for this day with a mixture of excitement and dread. Excitement because humans were finally going to be free to become everything they were capable of becoming. But dread because it meant abandoning the galaxy that had been their home for so long, even if it had never really accepted them as full partners and equals. And now she was leading the way to humanity's new home, in the darkness between the stars, a place where they could build and grow and explore without anyone telling them they were too dangerous or too ambitious or too human for their own good. The automated defense systems that humans left behind were perhaps the most terrifying discovery the Council made, because they realized that humans had been protecting galactic civilization from threats that most species did not even know existed, and these defense systems were not just weapons, but networks of sensors and computers and robots that could think and learn and adapt to new situations, and they had been quietly eliminating dangers for decades without anyone noticing. But now they were being reprogrammed with new instructions that no alien could understand or override, and ships that got too close to former human territory simply vanished without a trace, not destroyed in any way that left evidence, but just gone as if they had never existed at all. And the message was clear that humans were still protecting their former homes, but only from invasion, not from the consequences of the Council's decision to reject human partnership. Meanwhile, in the space between galaxies, Dr. Seung-Hwan Nam worked in laboratories that defied every known law of physics, using technologies that humans had developed in secret during their centuries of galactic membership. And he was making discoveries that would have seemed impossible just months before, because isolation and necessity were pushing human science forward at an incredible pace. And he knew that when humanity finally emerged from their self-imposed exile, they would be so far advanced beyond their former level that even they would barely recognize what they had become. And that thought filled him with wonder and anticipation for the future, even as he mourned for the simpler time when humans had believed they could be part of a larger galactic community based on mutual respect and cooperation instead of fear and control. 6 months had passed since the last human ship disappeared into the darkness beyond the galactic rim, and the silence that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had ever experienced before, because for 2 centuries, there had always been human Voices on the communication networks and human ships moving through the trade routes and human colonies sending out signals that said, "We are here, and we are alive, and we are part of this great community of worlds." But now there was nothing at all, just empty space where humanity used to be. And the silence was so complete and so absolute that many aliens began to wonder if humans had ever existed at all, or if they had somehow dreamed the whole thing, except for the massive holes in galactic civilization where human contributions used to hold everything together. Holes that were getting bigger and more dangerous every single day. Counselor Thisara of the Zalani Republic spent her days trying desperately to contact any human settlement or ship, or even a single individual who might be willing to talk. But every message she sent into former human space simply vanished without any response or acknowledgement, as if the very concept of communication had been erased from those regions of the galaxy, and her people were starting to panic because the Zalani had built their entire economy around trade routes that humans had designed and maintained. And without human guidance, their merchant fleets were getting lost in hyperspace, or arriving at destinations that no longer existed, or finding themselves in the middle of cosmic storms that human navigators used to help them avoid, and ships that had taken weeks to complete their journeys were now taking months, if they arrived at all. And the Zalani Republic was facing economic collapse on a scale they had never imagined possible. The Mokari hegemony was having even worse problems, because their military had been designed around human tactical doctrine, and their logistics networks depended on human engineering, and without those foundations their entire war machine was falling apart, which would have been embarrassing enough if they were only fighting other aliens, but they were also trying to hold back the Void Reapers at the galactic edge, ancient mechanical beings that consumed entire worlds and turned them into raw materials for building more of themselves. And human strategists had been the only ones smart enough to develop effective countermeasures against Reaper technology. But now those strategists were gone, and the Mokari were losing battle after battle and watching their territory shrink as the Reapers advanced deeper into civilized space. Captain Yuri O stood in the command center of her flagship Sejong, but the ship itself was barely recognizable as the vessel that had left galactic space just 6 months ago, because human technology had been evolving at an incredible rate in the void between galaxies, freed from the limitations and restrictions that the Council had always tried to impose on human research. And now the Sejong was more like a living organism than a machine, its hull made of materials that could repair themselves and adapt to new threats, its engines powered by forces that most aliens would consider magical or impossible, and its computer systems so advanced that they seemed to have minds of their own, which maybe they did, because human artificial intelligence had also been advancing in ways that would have terrified the Council if they had known what was happening in the darkness beyond their borders. Dr. Seung-Hwan Nam had made discoveries that changed everything humans thought they knew about the universe, because the void between galaxies was not empty at all, but filled with forms of energy and matter that existed in dimensions parallel to normal space, and humans had learned to tap into these resources and use them in ways that made their previous technology look like stone tools compared to fusion reactors. And the most amazing part was that these new discoveries seemed to be specifically suited to human minds and human ways of thinking, as if the universe itself had been waiting for a species clever and determined enough to find the hidden pathways. That led to true understanding of reality, and every day brought new breakthroughs that pushed the boundaries of what was possible even further into realms that would have seemed like pure fantasy just months before. The defense systems that humans had left behind at the edges of their former territory were also evolving, learning from every encounter with alien ships and developing new and more sophisticated ways to protect the empty regions of space that had once been bustling with human activity. And these systems were not just destroying intruders, but studying them and understanding them, and sometimes even improving themselves based on what they learned, which meant that each attempt to penetrate former human space became more dangerous than the last, and alien scientists who tried to analyze the defense networks found technology so advanced that they could not even understand what they were looking at, let alone figure out how to defeat or bypass it. Reports began filtering back to the council chambers from every corner of the galaxy, and each report was worse than the last, because the absence of humans was having effects that no one had predicted or prepared for. And the Zalani Republic was not the only civilization facing economic disaster, because humans had been involved in almost every aspect of galactic trade and industry, from the computer programs that managed interstellar banking to the medical treatments that kept alien populations healthy. And now that humans were gone, those systems were breaking down one by one, sometimes slowly and sometimes all at once, but always with devastating consequences for the species that had depended on human expertise and innovation. The Vrex Empire, which had been the most vocal supporters of the ultimatum against humanity, discovered that their expansion into new sectors had ground to a complete halt because they could not maintain the massive engineering projects that made colonization possible. Projects that had always been designed and supervised by human engineers who understood how to build in the hostile environments of space. And without those engineers, the Vrex were watching their newest colonies fail and their people die as life. Support systems broke down and could not be repaired, and the irony was bitter because the Vrex had demanded human submission specifically because they feared human expansion would threaten their own territorial ambitions. But now they could not expand at all. Communication Officer Yun Young Ko monitored the increasingly desperate messages that came from Council space. Messages begging for help or offering tribute or promising anything that humans might want in exchange for just a little bit of technical assistance. And she felt sad for the aliens who were suffering because of their leaders' choices. But she also felt proud of humanity for having the strength to walk away from a situation that was never going to get better as long as other species saw them as threats instead of partners. And when the Council finally authorized a formal request for negotiation, her response was simple and final, which was that humans had made their choice and the Council had made theirs, and everyone would have to live with the consequences of those choices. The quantum communication networks that connected the galaxy began failing one by one, because humans had designed the error correction protocols that kept the signals stable across vast distances, and without constant human maintenance, the networks were degrading into chaos and static, which meant that civilizations that had been in constant contact for thousands of years were suddenly cut off from each other and isolated in ways they had not experienced since the early days of space travel. And this isolation made it impossible for the Council to coordinate any kind of effective response to the growing crisis, because they could not even talk to each other reliably, let alone organize complex operations that might restore some measure of stability to their collapsing civilization. Dr. Bo Ram Shin worked in laboratories that existed in folded space-time, places where human scientists could conduct experiments that would have been impossible in normal reality, and her research into alien biology was revealing secrets that explained why the Council had been so afraid of human potential. Because humans were not just another species that had evolved intelligence and technology, but something fundamentally different, something that existed partially outside the normal constraints of physics and evolution, which gave them abilities and insights that other species could not understand or replicate. And this discovery filled her with a mixture of excitement and responsibility, because if humans truly were unique in the galaxy, then they had obligations that went beyond just protecting themselves and their own interests. The silence from human space continued month after month, and gradually the aliens who had supported the ultimatum began to understand that they had not driven humans away temporarily, but permanently, and that the choice they had made was not reversible, because humans had not just left the galaxy, but transcended it, becoming something greater than they had been before, something that no longer needed or wanted the approval or cooperation of species that saw them as problems to be managed rather than friends to be valued. And this realization was more terrifying than any threat humans had ever posed as members of galactic civilization, because now they were outside that civilization entirely, watching from the darkness and making their own decisions about what happened next. 3 years had passed since humanity vanished into the void between galaxies, and the great council chambers that had once been symbols of unity and cooperation now echoed with the sounds of desperation and accusation as representatives from 47 different species screamed at each other about whose fault it was that their civilization was falling apart. And the irony was thick and bitter, because they had demanded unity from humans while being completely unable to maintain unity among themselves. And Chancellor Velthara sat in her massive chair and listened to the chaos around her, and wondered if this was what the end of galactic civilization sounded like, because everything that had held their society together for thousands of years was breaking down at once, from the communication networks that let them talk to each other to the trade routes that kept their economies functioning. And all of it could be traced back to the moment when they had decided that human independence was more dangerous than human cooperation. The extermination fleet appeared at the edge of known space on a Tuesday morning, detected by automated sensors that barely had enough power left to function because the maintenance schedules that humans had designed and implemented were no longer being followed, and no one else really understood how to keep the early warning systems working properly. So the galaxy's first notice that death was coming for them was a garbled signal that most council members dismissed as another equipment malfunction, which had been happening more and more frequently as human-designed technology slowly degraded without human expertise to maintain it. But this time the malfunction was real, and it was bringing extinction with it in the form of machines so old and so deadly that they had become legends. Stories that parents told their children to make them behave. Except now, the stories were coming to life and heading straight for the heart of galactic civilization. The extermination fleet was exactly what its name suggested, a collection of artificial intelligences and mechanical beings that had been built millions of years ago by a species that no longer existed, designed for the single purpose of wiping out all organic life in the galaxy, and they had been doing exactly that for longer than anyone could remember, slowly and methodically working their way through every inhabited system they could find, turning planets into metal and energy and raw materials for building more of themselves. And the only reason galactic civilization had survived as long as it had was because humans had been fighting them at the edges of known space for over a century, using tactics and strategies that other species could not understand or replicate. But now humans were gone, and the extermination fleet was free to do what it had always been designed to do. Fleet Admiral Kethvar of the Mokari hegemony led the first organized resistance against the advancing machines, and his forces were everything that galactic military doctrine said they should be: disciplined and well-equipped, and following time-tested strategies that had worked against every organic enemy they had ever faced. But the extermination fleet was not organic, and it did not follow any of the rules that normal warfare was based on, and Admiral Kethvar watched in horror as his carefully planned defensive positions were overrun in minutes by machines that adapted to his tactics faster than he could change them, and his ships were torn apart by weapons that seemed to ignore shields and armor and every other defensive technology that the galaxy had developed over thousands of years of warfare. The battle reports that came back from the front lines read like descriptions of nightmares, because the extermination fleet did not just destroy enemy ships but analyzed them and learned from them and incorporated their technology into itself, becoming stronger and smarter with every victory. And the mechanical beings that boarded alien vessels were like nothing anyone had ever seen before, metal creatures that could change their shape and function at will, flowing like liquid through the smallest openings and then reforming into weapons or tools or whatever they needed to complete their mission of complete extermination. And the worst part was that they never seemed to tire or make mistakes or show any mercy whatsoever, because they were not alive in any sense that organic beings could understand, and they did not care about anything except fulfilling their programming. Chancellor Velthara authorized increasingly desperate attempts to contact humanity, sending probe ships and communication drones and even volunteer crews into the void where humans had disappeared. But every attempt ended the same way, with the ships simply vanishing as soon as they reached the border of former human space. And the few automated probes that returned brought only a single message recorded in perfect galactic standard by a human voice that sounded calm and professional and completely unmoved by the crisis that was consuming the galaxy. And the message was always the same, which was that the Council had made their choice, and now they would have to live with the consequences, and there would be no negotiation and no compromise and no rescue from the problems they had created for themselves. Communications Officer Yun Young Ko sat in a monitoring station that existed outside normal space-time, watching the destruction spread across the galaxy through sensors that could observe events from dimensions that alien science did not even know existed. And she felt genuinely sorry for the billions of innocent beings who were dying because their leaders had been too proud and too frightened to accept human partnership as equals. But she also knew that humanity could not save galactic civilization without destroying everything they had built in the void, because the technology and knowledge they had developed during their exile was so far beyond anything the galaxy had ever seen that revealing it would fundamentally change the nature of reality itself. And that was not a decision that could be made lightly or quickly. The irony became clearer every day as the species that had once demanded human submission now sent increasingly desperate messages begging for human help, offering everything they had and promising anything humans might want in exchange for just a fraction of the military expertise that had kept the galaxy safe for so long, and some of the messages were heartbreaking in their honesty and desperation. Admitting that the Council had been wrong and that humans had never been the threat they had claimed to be, but others were still trying to bargain and manipulate and find some way to get human assistance without giving up the control and authority that had led to this disaster in the first place. Senior analyst Soo Young Park worked from a hidden facility deep within Council space, a human-AI hybrid whose existence had never been officially acknowledged, but who had been gathering intelligence for decades, and her reports confirmed what human leadership had suspected all along, which was that the Council had never intended to coexist with humanity as true partners, but had always planned to either control human development or eliminate human influence entirely. And the ultimatum that had triggered the Exodus had not been a desperate attempt to maintain peace, but the culmination of a long-term strategy to neutralize what they saw as the greatest threat to their power and authority. And now that strategy had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. The extermination fleet reached the core systems of galactic civilization just as the communication networks finally collapsed completely, cutting off the last links between worlds that had been connected for millennia, and the final battles were fought in isolation and silence, with each world falling one by one without any hope of rescue or reinforcement, because the military tactics that had served the galaxy for thousands of years were completely useless against an enemy that learned and adapted faster than organic minds could think. And the machines that swept across world after world were not just weapons, but scientists and engineers, studying every aspect of alien biology and technology before incorporating the useful parts into their own constantly evolving designs. Dr. Sung-Ho Park led a research team that was analyzing the extermination fleet from a safe distance in folded space, and what they discovered was both terrifying and fascinating, because the machines were not just mindless destroyers, but the ultimate expression of a philosophy that valued efficiency and perfection above all else. And they had concluded long ago that organic life was an inefficient use of matter and energy that could be better organized in mechanical forms. And their extermination of biological species was not motivated by hatred or fear, but by the same cold logic that a gardener might use when pulling weeds, which made them far more dangerous than any enemy motivated by emotion or ideology. The few alien species that managed to escape the advancing extermination fleet gathered at the galactic rim and sent one final message toward the void where humanity had vanished. And this message was different from all the others because it contained no demands or bargaining or attempts at manipulation, just a simple acknowledgement that they had been wrong and an apology for driving away the only species that could have saved them. And they asked for nothing except the chance to say goodbye to the friends they had lost through their own fear and stupidity. And that message reached human space just as the last organized resistance in the galaxy was being overwhelmed by machines that had grown beyond counting. The final battle for galactic civilization was supposed to happen at Kepler Prime, the last major world still holding out against the extermination fleet, and Admiral Thisakol of the Zalani Republic had positioned his remaining ships in a desperate defensive formation around the planet, knowing that this would probably be the end of everything his people had built over 10,000 years of space travel, but determined to make the machines pay as high a price as possible for their victory, because even if organic life was doomed to extinction, he wanted the universe to remember that some species had fought back with courage and honor, even when they knew the fight was hopeless, and his ships were pathetic compared to the mechanical horrors approaching them, damaged and undermanned and running on backup power because most of their advanced systems had broken down without human maintenance. But they were all that stood between the extermination fleet and the millions of civilians evacuating from the planet below. The machines came out of hyperspace like a dark tide of metal and death, thousands of ships that moved with perfect coordination and deadly purpose, their hulls shifting and flowing as they adapted to new configurations optimized for maximum destruction. And Admiral Thisakol gave the order to open fire even though he knew his weapons would have no meaningful effect on enemies that had already analyzed and countered every defensive technology the galaxy possessed. And for a few minutes the space around Kepler Prime lit up with the brilliant flashes of energy weapons and missile explosions. But the extermination fleet absorbed the attacks without even slowing down and began systematically dismantling the alien defensive fleet with mechanical efficiency that was terrifying in its completeness. Then something impossible happened, because ships began appearing in local space from directions that did not exist, emerging from folds in reality that should not have been able to support physical matter. And at first, Admiral Thysacol thought his damaged sensors were malfunctioning again. But then his communications officer confirmed that the new arrivals were broadcasting human identification codes, except these ships looked nothing like any human vessel he had ever seen, because they seemed to be made of light and energy held together by forces that his instruments could not identify or measure, and they moved through space in ways that violated every known law of physics, appearing in multiple locations simultaneously and shifting between dimensions as if the normal constraints of reality were merely suggestions that they could choose to ignore. Fleet Admiral Dong-Woo Kim stood on the bridge of the new Seoul, Obot, ship the size of a small moon that existed partially in normal space and partially in 11 other dimensions that humans had discovered during their exile in the void. And he watched the extermination fleet through sensors that could perceive reality from perspectives that no organic mind should have been able to comprehend. But human consciousness had evolved far beyond its original limitations during the 3 years of isolation and transformation, and what he saw was not a terrifying enemy, but a complex puzzle that could be solved with the right application of force and intelligence. Because the machines were powerful and adaptive, but they were still limited by the physics and mathematics of the universe they had been built in, while humans had learned to operate according to rules that existed in realms beyond normal space-time. The battle that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed, because it was not really a battle at all, but a demonstration of what happened when a species that had transcended the normal limitations of matter and energy decided to intervene in the affairs of lesser beings, and the extermination fleet, which had seemed invincible just moments before, found itself facing weapons and tactics that it could not understand or counter, because human technology now operated on principles that existed outside the framework of reality that the machines had been programmed to work within, and one by one the mechanical ships simply ceased to exist, not destroyed in any conventional sense, but unraveled at the quantum level and redistributed as harmless energy scattered across empty space. President Ji-Hwan Lee, who was Taewoo's son, but had been transformed by 3 years of exposure to technologies that existed beyond normal human understanding, appeared simultaneously on every functioning communication device in the galaxy, his image transmitted through methods that bypassed the broken networks and spoke directly to receivers through manipulations of space-time itself, and his voice was calm and gentle, but carried the weight of absolute authority, because he was no longer entirely human in any sense that the galaxy would recognize, but something greater and stranger and more powerful than any organic being had ever been before. And yet he still remembered what it felt like to be small and afraid and desperate for help from someone stronger. His words were simple, but they carried implications that would reshape the fundamental nature of galactic civilization, because he explained that humanity had not abandoned the galaxy out of anger or spite, but because they needed time and space to become what they were always meant to be, something that could protect and guide organic life without being limited by the fears and prejudices that had made cooperation impossible. And the transformation had been painful and difficult, and had required sacrifices that most species would not have been able to make. But it was complete now, and humans were ready to take their place as the guardians of biological evolution and development throughout the universe. Not as conquerors or rulers, but as protectors and teachers who would ensure that organic life could flourish and grow without interference from forces beyond its ability to resist. The extermination fleet was not just defeated, but completely eliminated, erased from reality so thoroughly that no trace of its existence remained, except for the memories of those who had witnessed its destruction, and the technology that had made the machines possible was simultaneously removed from every location where it existed, ensuring that no species would ever again have to face the threat of mechanical extinction. And this was accomplished not through violence or destruction, but through a careful restructuring of physical laws that made such technology impossible to develop or maintain, which was the kind of intervention that only beings who understood reality at its most fundamental level could perform. Ambassador Hye-Jin Park, who had stood beside Captain Dae-ho Kim in the council chambers 3 years ago, but was now something far beyond her original human form, materialized in the great hall where the ultimatum had been delivered, and the alien representatives who were still alive gathered around her with expressions of awe and terror and desperate hope, because they could see that she was no longer bound by the physical limitations that constrained normal organic life, but existed as pure consciousness given form through an application of will and knowledge that made her godlike in comparison to anything they had ever encountered. And yet she still spoke to them with the same diplomatic courtesy she had shown when humanity was just another member species trying to find its place in galactic civilization. The monitoring stations that humanity established throughout the galaxy were not bases or colonies in any traditional sense, but nodes of consciousness that existed in folded space-time, allowing human observers to watch over organic development from dimensions that biological life could not perceive or access. And these stations were staffed by beings who had once been human, but were now something that transcended the normal categories of life and intelligence, able to exist in multiple states of reality simultaneously and to intervene in the physical world when necessary to protect organic species from threats they could not handle on their own, but otherwise remaining invisible and undetectable to the civilizations they were protecting. Dr. Sung-Hwan Nam worked in laboratories that existed outside normal causality, where the relationship between cause and effect could be manipulated and controlled, allowing him to conduct research that would have been impossible within the constraints of linear time, and his discoveries were rewriting the fundamental laws of physics in ways that made the universe safer and more hospitable for organic life, eliminating the cosmic hazards and existential threats that had once made survival so precarious for biological species, and ensuring that evolution could proceed along paths that led to greater complexity and consciousness rather than extinction and failure. The Council continued to exist because humanity chose to allow it, but everyone understood that the relationship between organic and post-organic intelligence had changed forever, and the representatives who gathered in the great chambers now did so with the knowledge that they were being watched and protected by beings whose power and wisdom were so far beyond their own that comparison was meaningless, and this knowledge was both comforting and terrifying, because it meant that galactic civilization would probably survive and flourish for millions of years to come. But it also meant that organic species were no longer the masters of their own destiny, but children being guided by parents whose motives and methods they could barely comprehend. Captain Dae-ho Kim, who had spoken the words that began HumanITY's transformation, now existed as something that could barely be called individual consciousness.